According to the U.S. Department of Justice, someone is sexually assaulted somewhere in America every 2 minutes. Ann Ream is the founder of the Voices and Faces Project. It was created to bring the names and faces of victims of sexual violence and trafficking to the attention of the public. They've collected testimony from more than 300 survivors. The Voices and Faces Project began in the U.S. but is now expanded internationally, most recently to Atenco, Mexico. Ann says she started the project because she realized that sexual violence and trafficking are crimes that very often drive men and women underground.
There are huge incentives to silence around the issue of sexual violence, and we really don't want often to hear from survivors. And one of the things that I found interesting about that silence is it not only, and troubling about that silence, is it not only often isolates victims, but it also often really removes the culture and the community from the realities of sexual violence. So we don't see, we don't know, we don't hear, and therefore we don't have to confront. And our project was born of that realization that if we could collect those stories and bring them to the attention of the public, we could change minds and hearts and public policies.
I think there's probably a perception out there that most victims of sexual violence don't want to tell their stories.
I think that there is that perception, and one of the things that, and I think honestly I myself had that perception to some degree when I entered into this documentary project. And one of the very amazing and moving things that happened early on, we started with 5 survivors, went to 5 different women in the U.S., and within a year or two we had over 300 survivors in this project. And very often we'll receive emails or we'll receive calls from people saying, I lived through this. The world doesn't want to hear about this, but I have a story to tell, and I want to tell this story in a place where my story is going to be honored, and I feel safe telling it. And one of the reasons I might argue that incentive to silence exists is that we have not effectively, from the standpoint of the media and those of us working in communications, always created those safe zones for survivors to share their stories. I mean, having said that, it's a difficult thing to go that public. It is a difficult emotional challenge. There are ethical considerations for our project and the survivor, but ultimately, I myself have been really surprised and at times amazed at the hunger that survivors of violence have to be heard.
What did you learn from hearing these stories? If you've heard several hundred of them now, are there things about their stories that have surprised you?
You know, I think there are a lot of surprises, and there are a lot of things you hear that you think, I've heard that before, and I will likely hear that again. And those are sort of the heartbreaking moments. One of the most powerful surprises for me as someone who done work in the rape crisis movement and saw that as the most necessary community, which I think it is for survivors when they're seeking healing, was hearing survivors say over and over again that the person they turned to was a colleague or someone in their faith-based community or a member of their family, and that very often those communities were not prepared for or ready to respond to them compassionately or with understanding, which really led to us wanting to get these stories out there to a broader community than just our own community. And I think another very powerful surprise for me was the degree to which many of these survivors, when they sought justice, either through our legal system, through the civil courts, or just through a confrontation, be it with their parish priest or with a military officer if they've been victims of sexual violence, for example, in the military, was how often institutions resisted that. And a continual theme in the story collection that I've done is that institutions take on all comers. That if you are someone who has lived through sexual violence and you've lived through that violence at the hand of an institution, whether it is a faith-based community or the U.S. military or wherever this community may be, you are going to bump up against some very powerful barriers.
That's a depressing theme, to think that institutions can't, are going to vigorously work against victims of sexual crimes.
And I think part of what happens is that institutions look and say, revelations of what is happening in our community will be damaging to who we are and what we stand for. We are doing important and good work, and we can't afford to confront those revelations. And if we can set aside, individual victims, move them aside and keep moving forward one by one, we'll be okay. Maybe we can try to write this privately. Maybe we can try to address this behind the scenes. But the question becomes, what happens when individuals are the institution? Ultimately, if you do that too much and too often, it's a tragedy for individuals, and it's a tragedy, as we've seen in the Catholic Church, for example, for institutions, that you have to honor those individual stories.
You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell, and I'm talking with Ann Ream. She's the founder of the Voices and Faces Project, and it was created to bring names and faces of victims of sexual violence and trafficking to the attention of the public, and they've collected testimony from more than 300 survivors. And we were going to talk about a specific situation in Mexico, in Atenco, Mexico, and really it was a labor confrontation. I guess in essence. Tell us about what happened there.
It was a protest, a labor protest in which the police responded aggressively in a very arbitrary fashion. Over 200 persons were incarcerated. This was a sweep through a community. In fact, two of the women I interviewed weren't even on the streets at all. They were in private homes and were dragged out of their homes and arrested. Of the 200 people who were arrested, 47 were women. Over half of those women reported being raped, sexually assaulted, or otherwise tortured in transport to prison, which means they were literally thrown into police vehicles, piled up on top of one another, raped and sexually assaulted on the way to prison, denied forensic exams when they arrived at prison, and beaten again and tortured while in prison. The basic facts of this case actually are not in question. I mean, the Mexican Supreme Court has made a public statement that human rights abuses, including rape and torture, occurred. 34 perpetrators have been named based on a federal investigation, and yet still 4 years later, this occurred May 2006. 4 years later, there's no justice for these women.
These women were essentially flower sellers, and there was a dispute over where people could sell flowers.
There was a dispute over where people could sell flowers. The local government had reached an agreement. Some of these women, several of the women I interviewed, were not flower sellers at all. They weren't necessarily involved in the protest. One was someone who had come to do an interview about what was happening in Atenco. She was a writer. Another was a nurse, for example, who came because she heard about the beatings and what was happening on the ground and wanted to help. So the protest, everyone, every single person who was incarcerated has been released. I think what the Mexican government might say about that is, there's your justice. But of course, that's the first step in a pale version of justice, when police officers on the watch of the Mexican government, and these are local, state and federal police officers, are guilty of rape and torture.
And it sounds like it's hard to conclude anything but that somebody gave an order to basically torture and rape people. And this was done in mass.
Absolutely.
To terrorize a population.
Well, that's one of the most important things that you have to confront with a case like this. Atenco is an amazing community with a history of action and activism, and this, in very significant ways, was a deliberate attempt to break a population, and specifically to criminalize social protest. And if you can rape and torture a community of women, it is not only devastating to them, and it is most importantly devastating to them, but it also has a ripple effect into communities that says, if you engage in this sort of protest, you will be held accountable in these ways, these severe ways that are really violations of international law.
Now, we have several clips of the women of Atenco telling their stories. What should we hear first?
Edith was one of the first women I interviewed, a really amazing and powerful woman. She was in her 50s, and as I mentioned earlier, she was a nurse who came to help because she knew that there was a mass beating at this protest. And she actually tried to flee the scene and was apprehended and dragged into one of the police vans and was sexually assaulted and tortured. And one of the things she said to me that was so powerful and so telling was that her feeling at the moment when she knew that this was going to happen.
Cuando me habían detenido y que si me había dado miedo, yo decía, bueno.
When they arrested me, they asked me if I was scared, and I said yes, I was scared. But then I thought, well, now it's my turn. We're not the first ones. It's happened to others.
Knowing that sexual violence is so rampant in Mexico, knowing that when you are a part, even if only indirectly, of a protest like this, you will be targeted. Now it's my time, really said everything about the conditions there.
Now, Edith is one of the women who chose to file suit and move on legally and try to get justice through legal channels?
Yes, there's a petition has been filed with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and 11 women are linked to that petition, and she is one of those women. And I should say regarding that petition, because I think it's very significant, that not only has the Mexican government declined to respond to that petition in a timely manner, they have still not responded. They have actually also actively shared with other governments a version of events that are demonstrably false.
Well, who in the Mexican government is responsible for this? Is this a federal government decision to not respond in a timely manner and to ignore this, or is it a local or a state government issue?
That's a great question. It's ultimately a federal decision. It's the president's decision. Felipe Calderon needs to decide that this matters enough to take action. And your question's also interesting because part of what I think organizers would say has been the tactic of the government has been to say, this isn't a federal case, this is a local case, or this is a state case. We don't have jurisdiction here. That's a relatively timeless tactic. When the government of Mexico on its watch sees human rights violations at the local, state, and federal level that are well documented and does nothing, regardless of the pressure from the international community, the fact that the Supreme Court of Mexico has ruled that these violations occur, that's, in a certain sense, a significant symbolic failure and a huge ethical failure.
Is there a best-case scenario for their case at the Inter-American Court if the women who brought it win? What'll happen?
What will happen is the perpetrators are going to be held accountable. They are going to get sentences that are significant. You know, in Mexico, in the vast majority, for example, of states in Mexico, it is not a crime to beat your wife. There are rural areas in Mexico where if you are convicted of sexual violence or rape, you may receive only a fine. So punishment of the 34 named perpetrators is a first step, but it has to be significant punishment. And I think it needs to be a punishment that sets an example broadly that Mexico will not tolerate these abuses. The second aspect of justice that is critical is reparations. These women have existed for 4 years with their perpetrators existing freely in their communities or other Mexican communities. They have endured a huge amount of personal and economic and social strife, all in the name of giving voice and face to this issue. And that form of justice is also critical.
You're listening to Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell talking with Anne Ream. She's the founder of the Voices and Faces Project, and it was created to bring the names and faces of victims of sexual violence and trafficking to the attention of the public, and they've collected testimony from more than 300 survivors. You can go to the internet and find out all about it. What kind of things do you have planned in the future? Where do you see the project going and evolving?
It's been very exciting for us. When we launched this project, we began domestically and knew that there were many very important stories in the U.S. that we had to collect. But one of the things that was most striking early on, because there's a web component to our project, voicesandfaces.org, we would often hear from survivors in other regions or other countries, and their stories were incredibly powerful and important. And what we look for in our stories, every story of a victim of sexual violence and trafficking matters. They are all stories that we as a public need to confront. But what we are very interested in is finding those stories that illuminate broader truths, often systemic truths, about violence against women and specifically sexual violence and trafficking. So, for example, we will be traveling in the fall to Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been referred to as the rape capital of the world, where it is estimated credibly that 1 in 3 women has been a victim of rape. So we're going to be there in the fall. We're going to also be going to Burma, Thailand, and Cambodia, all regions where trafficking is an issue and where, because of other forms of political or social oppression, women are doubly at risk. And that's one of the things we look at when we story collect. How do we connect these forms of oppression? How do we show that when a region is volatile, economically or socially or politically, when women live in a war zone, they are doubly or triply vulnerable, that women are always more vulnerable to violence, sexual violence specifically, in chaos. So part of what we look to in the coming months is to find those stories, to go into those regions and find those stories, and to find a way to tell them that calls communities to action, that gets people in the U.S. and beyond to say, what can I do to change this?
Do you have any suggestions for what could be done on an international level that people here could do something to help people in Burma or Congo or wherever they're victims of sexual violence?
I mean, I think one of the first things Americans, and many Americans know this and others don't, need to confront actively is we exert a huge amount of influence across the globe. For example, in Atenco, one of the most significant things happening right now is that there's a congressional letter being drafted demanding justice for the women in Atenco. That letter is being drafted in response to the demands of people in our community in the U.S., calling on their congresspeople and saying, you need to bring pressure to bear. Those forms of pressure are powerful. One of the allies that the Voices and Faces works with is Amnesty International, and in fact, Amnesty West was our gateway into originally capturing the stories of Atenco. And if you visit their site, amnestyusa.org, you're going to see a host of cases that not only demand action, but a place to take action, whether it's people to write to or emails to send. And that form of action makes a huge difference. The other thing I think that is critical for those of us in the U.S. is to understand what is going on in these regions where we may not physically be ourselves, but where the U.S. has a presence, and to speak out about it in our own communities, which is to actually say, for example, when we're talking about immigration issues, while we talk about this, we need to consider what women in Atenco are living through. So to some degree, it's bringing those stories into your own communities and discussions and taking a more personally activist role, actually having, I like to say, the courage to be the person at the cocktail party everybody gets mad at. To do that can be a very powerful thing, and hopefully the stories that we collect give people the ammunition to do that.
Can you imagine a world where there's no violence against women?
I dream of a world where there's no violence against women. I cannot imagine that world right now. And that is heartbreaking to say. But I think we need to change the way we look at women, the way we value women. One of the really heartbreaking moments in the interview with one of the women that I met with in Atenco, a woman named Claudia, was when she talked to me about being beaten by the police. And as she was beaten, one of the things he said to her was, "Why aren't you home cooking and cleaning?" And that spoke volumes to me about how we value women and how we still, collectively as an international community, perceive women's place. And I think until those core causes, until we confront the attitudes that lead to violence, I cannot imagine a world without such violence.
Ann Ream's the founder of the Voices and Faces Project, created to bring the names and faces of the victims of sexual violence and trafficking to the attention of the public. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jerome.
Earlier, we heard from Edith Rosales Gutierrez, a nurse who was a victim of sexual assault in Atenco, Mexico. She was interviewed by Ann Ream for the Voices and Faces Project. And I'm Jerome McDonnell, and we're going to go out today on a little music from the benefit CD created for the Voices and Faces Project, which we heard from earlier in the program. The project gives a voice to the silence surrounding rape and sexual violence, and you can find more information about the CD on our website. The CD was created by musicians who felt strongly about the issue of sexual violence. And here's She Lives Alone by John Rauhaus.